Hello! This is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And I hope you're having a good day. As you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and they will appear here in my chat room, and we can talk directly. And this was a busy weekend for me. I finished up the numerology book, which is currently on order to the publisher. If you ordered the ebook, you have it. They have already been sent out. And that was something that I finished the final editing for at 6 o'clock yesterday morning. Hello to Mary Cavalcante in the chat room. Then later in the day, we did our pagan news broadcast for the month of June, which was a lovely experience. I hope that you saw and enjoyed that. Mary says, nice to see you again. It's always good to see you, Mary. Hello to Janet in the chat room. And then last evening, we did our solstice ritual here on Corellian TV with Mary Cavalcante and our other ritualists, including Mary Hawk and Alyssa Max and Kim, briefly Jason Highcorell, Zach Parker, and Ebony Nash, of course. And Ebony just recently had her birthday. Happy birthday, Ebony. And it was a lovely day. It was a very warm weekend, a very warm week last week. Today is a cooler day. It's only in the 80s, which is delightful. And yeah, it was a busy weekend. Last week, we were talking about emotion. And Mary says, it was another great ritual. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Mary. I'm glad you did. And I agree, it was a great ritual. Very interesting chat room. Mary says it's 97 there in Florida. It's apparently 83 here in Illinois. But I think it was 97 yesterday, or at least it felt like it. So it's nice to have a little bit of coolness. But, you know, I'm not a big one on complaining about the temperature, but I will say it's been a little warm lately. Last week, we were talking a lot about happiness and the idea of noticing the positive things, and that this will help you to be happier in your life. And I firmly believe that it does. And yet today, I have set a subject that might be considered noticing the negative things. I have decided to talk about my least favorite meme that I see so often online. And you might ask for how this connects, but you'll remember I also said that noticing the good things doesn't mean not noticing the bad things. It means taking positive action when you do and not obsessing about them. So I thought I'd talk about why I do not feel good about this meme. My least favorite internet meme, which I've seen several times this morning, which is why it came to be our subject today, goes like this. I miss the old days when witchcraft was underground. Now, Becky thinks she's a witch because she can buy sage at WholeFoods. There are so many things wrong with this. And I'm going to start, contrary to what I thought I was going to do, I'm going to start with the number one thing that's wrong about this. Because one, it focuses on negativity and on creating friction between the older people and the younger people in our community. I've seen this play itself out so often in our community, and it's one of the biggest problems, I think, that we have. A sense of gatekeeping and exclusivity against people who are simply new in the community and maybe don't know as much because they are new. And some people think it's okay to then treat them badly. This is never okay. It's very bad for the community overall, and it certainly doesn't say anything good about those who do it. I've often used the phrase that much of our community beats young people away with sticks. And then they wonder where the young people are. Or you hear the so-called elders complain that young people don't listen to them. But when your reaction to meeting them was to insult them, of course they're never going to listen to you again or seek out your advice. Why would they? You blew your one chance to give them a cause to listen to you, and you did it yourself. I'm not sympathetic to those elders who claim no one's listening to them, because I've watched them discourage people from listening to them. If I were a young people entering, if I were a young person entering the community, a lot of these people I wouldn't listen to, because what I've heard them say was not good. And they have other really good things to say. But once you've stopped someone from listening to you, they're never going to hear that. So you need to be welcoming. You need to behave decently in the first place if you want to have a second time for people to listen to you. And you don't do that by making fun of someone because they know less than you, or because they're brand new in the community, or because they're not as connected as you think they ought to be. But that's been a major behavior among a lot of the older people in this community. Now, not every part of this community, not every person, and you can tell the difference between those groups that are successful and those that are not. And by successful, I mean you'll see young faces, you'll see a next generation, and they'll have some clue of their history. You know, I often talk about how dispiriting it is to see how many pagans don't know what the Pentacle Quest was. But when they've been rejected by the older generation, who are they going to learn it from? Who don't know the controversy that was caused by that whole Frost issue in the 1980s, and that there was a strong reaction to it, and think that nobody said anything. But where would they learn about it when that older generation simply turned them away at the door? Didn't mean they didn't go on into the community. It means that they formed their own part of the community that doesn't connect to the older one. And that's how our history gets lost. I'm very proud to belong to a tradition which does maintain its history and which does welcome younger people and discourages this kind of negative behavior. And there are others like us in the community, but I'd really like to see more of it. And good morning to Bimby in the chat room, who says, "Good morning, Lord Don." It's good to see you, Bimby. I cannot too strongly state how much we need to stop having negative reactions as a community to younger people, because without younger people, we may as well just hang up our coats, because there is no future without another generation. Hello to Swackfan in the chat room. And again, I have never behaved this way, at least not intentionally. And people I have trained and who respect my opinion should not be behaving this way. But there are lots of people in our community who somehow think it makes them look better if they behave in a petty manner to younger people. This meme, the whole Becky buys her sage at WholeFoods meme, is petty and childish and does not make anyone look good. Now, I'm not meaning that as an attack on any individual who has posted it, because I realize people don't always think deeply about what they're posting. But what does this meme actually say? The first thing it says is that this person is rhapsodizing about good old days that they were not here for. Because if you're posting this meme, you were not here in the good old days. You can't have been, for two important reasons. The first is we did not use sage in that way in the time period that's being referred to. Because obviously they're referring to the use of sage, as is commonly used today, for cleansing, and particularly space cleansing. And Mary says, "I think it's an attack on the pagan community to try to tell us to stay underground." I think it certainly has that effect in our community. And hello to Black Crystal in the chat room. The use of sage as the common agent for metaphysical cleansing, what some people call smudging, but is traditionally called sensing, or more elaborately fumigation, was introduced beginning in the late 1970s and generally in the 1980s. It does not go back in what we would generally call Western witchcraft any farther than that. It was introduced from the New Age community and is not what we traditionally used for those purposes. Now, we did do this traditionally, but we would have been much more likely to use frankincense or certain other herbs. Cedar might be one of them, or lavender. But I think frankincense and possibly myrrh would have been the dominant ones. But what happened is in the 1980s, sage, 1970s and 80s, a number of Native American religious teachers mounted a major campaign to introduce Native American teachings to a wider audience, which really caught hold in the New Age community, which at the time was closer allied to the pagan community than it is today. And they really embraced the idea of using sage, and they marketed it extremely well. And it became easy to get sage. And if you really remember the good old days, one of the things you'll remember is it was hard to get a lot of the things that we use in metaphysical practice. The ease of obtaining sage made it the preference, nothing else. You could get sage at any metaphysical bookstore and frequently at other places as well. That gave it a lot of benefit to the community. That's why it became so commonly used. But if you really remember the good old days, you will not remember using sage for that purpose. We didn't do it. We did use sage for a variety of herbal purposes and occasionally for sensing in certain ways, but not for that one. It wasn't what we did. So if you're making a big deal about how you think that's the big difference because we had to hunt hard for our sage in the old days, you don't remember the old days. It's not what we were hunting for. The second thing, I started this program talking about how I had finished the final editing for the numerology book yesterday morning. Part of that book talks about the origin of my personal interest in numerology. And that was a very nostalgic piece to be writing, but it's directly relevant to this situation because the strongest portion of my personal interest in numerology was being given by my mother a tiny pocket book on the subject of numerology in the early 70s when I was a small child. I would guess around 1972. I'm not exactly certain what the year was. I may still have the book. If so, it will have a copyright date. But where did we get that book? We got it in the checkout aisle of the local grocery store. I think it was a Grab It Here store. Might have been a Kroger store. We went to both of those frequently, both of them every Saturday. And they both had interesting book sections, as I remember. And it was there not just in a specialty section, it was right there in the checkout aisle. My mother was the head of the Karelian tradition at that time. She strongly emphasized and encouraged metaphysics as an interest for me from a very early age, and so it was. And if I showed any interest in anything metaphysical, it was purchased for me. Also, at that time, around the same period, my mother was buying Man, Myth, and Magic magazines for me at that same store in downtown Danville. Actually, it was suburban Danville. If you can believe that Danville has suburbs, it does. But when we're talking about when all this was underground, I've got to disillusion you on one major subject. It has never been underground in my lifetime. You may have been underground. Your particular group may have kept its practices underground, but this movement has not been underground really at any time that I have been alive that I can remember. And I am 61 years old. So if you want to talk about when this was underground, to me, you'd better be over 61 years old. Because we could buy these things readily in very public places when I was a child. So I don't know what the heck you're talking about, Becky buying her sage in WholeFoods, because we were buying our metaphysical magazines at Kroger's. Now, if you wanted to get The more serious metaphysical magazines, of course, they were a little harder to find, and they were part of an underground press at that time. I'm not saying they were not. I'm saying that the whole thing was not underground. I can remember buying other more in-depth books on witchcraft right here in Danville. One of my favorite books was the Golden. Oh, I don't have it in front of me, but it was the Golden Treasury of the Witch's Almanac. And that was a few years later, but around 1976, I believe it was, which I bought right here in Danville on what at the time was the Danville Mall at a tobacconist shop that also had a book stand. I also remember getting a copy of the Vangelo delle Streghe, or the Aradia, I should say, at that same place. A perfectly mainstream store. So, let's be careful what we talk about and what we remember, because you're not remembering reality when you post this meme. This is not what actually was. Yes, a lot of people were underground, but the movement has not been underground for a long time. One of the things I remember very vividly is watching Leonard Nimoy on the show In Search Of in the 1970s, reporting on the Cabot tradition and the coming of age of one of the Cabot daughters, where they were talking about Cabot witchcraft and rites of passage rituals and so forth in the 1970s. So, if you want to talk to me about when all of this was underground, again, you'd better be a lot older than I am. Now, I was underground at that time. Well, no, I actually wasn't, come to think of it. I have been publicly out as a witch since I was 13 years old. I was in junior high school, so I was not actually underground at that time, but the rest of my family were. They took a few more years to come out. The fact that I was able to do it and not have any problems was one of the reasons that many of the others did later come out. Part of the reason the Correllian tradition became a public tradition, because we had been testing the ground ahead of time. Lady Crystal had been doing things in public before the tradition itself went public. So she had been public as well. So when you talk to us about when everything was underground, maybe you were underground, but you're confusing our history quite a bit. It's like when people love to talk about how nobody used the term witch to describe themselves. They were all cunning folk. Except that's not true in the United States. In the United States, witch was commonly used as a self-descriptor by a number of people practicing witchcraft, a few of whom were pagans, some of whom were Christians, some of whom were something else. But there's plenty of evidence of this going back throughout United States history. And it was also used to describe other people as well. The whole cunning folk thing is applicable to the United Kingdom, but does not describe this country at all. Our history is different. And it's very dangerous to confuse the two. And people are doing this all the time. And why do they do it? Well, we keep cutting off the connection between our generations. How do we do that? One generation rejects the next. They want to be petty. They want to be self-important. They want to look down on that next generation because they have wounded egos that they have not done shadow work to fix. And somehow it makes them feel better about themselves to diss that next generation, to use a modern term to describe it. One Swagfan says, I miss Kroger. And yeah, and hello to Black Crystal, if I've not already said hello. But this is not how a confident person behaves. This is not the way we should be behaving. We should be embracing that next generation. And if we find that we feel their knowledge is not comparable to our own, there are two things that we should do to deal with that. First, we should look at our own knowledge and make sure that we are remembering it correctly, and that we remember that you could buy this sort of thing at Kroger's in the 1970s. and even the late 1960s, that there were television shows about metaphysics um, during this same period, that there were mainstream books being written about it in this same period. Um, and that just because many of us as individuals were underground, not everything was underground. And secondly, if we find that we do feel we remember things correctly, then we should gently educate that younger generation, but not by trying to embarrass them, not by trying to lord ourselves over them, not by doing anything to alienate them, but saying, "Oh, that's not quite how I remember it." Or, well, when I was such and such an age, or, that's the version that I'm familiar with is, or any number of ways that you can introduce a different point of view without making someone feel bad about what they've said. And generally, this is always going to be a better thing to do, particularly for the community, because we need that younger generation. And, I'm going to go back to all those elders complaining that younger people aren't listening to them. Well, did you encourage them to listen to you? Did you give them a reason to listen to you? And did you listen to the elders when you were young? Some of the elders who are saying this, I knew when they were younger, and they weren't any bigger on listening to the elders themselves. Some of this is just human nature, but I think we need to encourage that younger generation. We need to bolster them. We need to make them feel good about themselves. And if sometimes we feel they're misinformed, then we need to find positive ways to give them better information, not negative ones. And sometimes that means keeping silent at that moment and waiting for a better time. Because, if you're confident in what you believe, you don't necessarily have to feel right at that moment. You can let someone else be momentarily wrong and present better information at a more convenient time. You certainly don't have to embarrass them publicly. But so many people just can't let that moment pass. And Bimby says, oh, the 70s were huge for metaphysics. That's when I got into it. It seems almost cyclical. It was also big in the 90s and today. And yes, that's true. And yeah, it is cyclical. And, in keeping with that idea about how you have to be older than me to remember when this was underground, I've got news for you. It was also big in many other historical periods. There was a huge witchcraft revival in the 1870s. In the early 1900s, witchcraft and metaphysics were the hot topic. In the 1920s, they were a hot topic. In the 1940s, they enjoyed a considerable revival. None of this has really been as underground as a lot of us like to pretend it was. Individuals were. Individual groups and organizations may have been. But as a movement, and as a subject of public interest, it's hard to say it was really underground. The extent to which it enjoyed popularity during these revivals varies, I suppose we would say. But I talk about the 1870s. It goes a lot farther back than that. I mean, if you want to study ceremonial magic, what era are you looking at? You're looking at the 16th century and before. If you're familiar with the history of Druidism, you should know who Yola Marganog was. There is so much there that the proponents of the modern creation of everything really don't want you to notice. And they are aided by things like this Becky buying her sage at WholeFoods meme, which increases that idea that there was nothing before the modern era. And the truth is, we belong to a movement that is hundreds of years old. It just lacks a certain amount of connectivity. That is what we need to change for the future. And we need not to remember, or we need not to remember false histories that some people want to promote to us. And I'll tell you, the biggest promoter of that false history that everything that we do was created in the 1960s is conservative Christianity. They believe that because it conflicts with their own false history that they were the only people here. They would love for us to believe it too. And many of us, unfortunately, have bought that story, but it is not the case. These things were not created out of nothing in the 1960s. And we need to remember everything that has poured into this modern movement and not separate ourselves from what gave birth to us. I suppose if you want to say your individual movement is a modern variation of what came before it, that's great. But let's not say they're disconnected. If you practice Wicca and you don't think you're connected to alchemy, you are an idiot. You also have not studied alchemy. If you practice Wicca and you think you're not connected to hermetics or to ceremonial magic, you're an idiot, or you haven't studied those systems. And so many more things, not to mention the very long practice of witchcraft, which is fully documented. The only question is the amount of connection. If you practice witchcraft and you think Margaret Murray was a charlatan, then you have not studied the rest of her career, and you're badly misinformed. Now, if you think her theories were ridiculous, some of her theories were ridiculous. However, if you think everything she said was ridiculous, you need to look at it more. If you think Gerald Gardner created everything out of nothing, you need to look at it a little bit more and read more authors than Hutton. Although I would say that on any subject, you need to read more authors than Hutton. You need to read about the actual diaries of Dorothy Clutterbuck. Parts of them have now been published. They were published by Hazelton, at least by Hazelton. They are the smoking gun that everyone says isn't there, that it's very hard to say she was not a pagan priestess after you read her writings. And yet Hutton says they were the smoking gun that proves she was not. I assume because he assumed no one else was ever going to read them, because at that time they were not easily accessed. But if you read them, they could be published in a pagan magazine today, and no one would question them, except for the excessive use of thee and thou. But some people still do that, and it was a mark of that era. There is so much more here than a lot of contemporary people want to admit, and it's one of the reasons that we keep losing our past. I've heard people say with a straight face that Wicca started in the 1990s. I'm sure I will yet live long enough to hear people say it started in the 2000s. Neither Wicca nor metaphysics in general are that young. And the truth is, it's all really been one movement. In certain periods, one tradition will dominate, but we really need to look at it that way while working to reestablish our moral equivalence in the wider society, because we've been here the whole time. We have not been out sacrificing children. We have not been out doing terrible things, and we have a very verifiable history. And Bimby says, I would love it if you wrote a book on the history of practical magic. And we will definitely put that on the long list of books that I'm writing through Corellian Publishing, because we really should. Because as you see, I have a lot to say on it. The problem with that is that to thoroughly back it will take a lot of research in terms of dates and numbers, but on the other hand, every book does. So yeah, the history of magic, I think, is something I need to write about. The autobiography is something I still need to write. It's just hard to write your autobiography when you're still living. But then I can think of several celebrities who've written several of them and just keep on going, so maybe I could too. So lots of books coming in the future. But this was my thought for today. And what it comes down to is not, oh, this is such a terrible meme, so much as this is not how we treat younger people. We need to be welcoming. We need to be positive. when we meet a younger person who perhaps does not have accurate knowledge, we need to welcome them, make them feel good about having met us, make them feel good about being in the community, and then show them what they don't know yet in a positive way that doesn't question their self-worth. That's how we continue our community. That's how we build our future. And so I hope that as you go forward from this program, you'll remember this. When you're dealing with younger people who perhaps might not know everything that you think they should know. And, even if you're a younger person listening to this today, you're not going to be young forever. One day you'll be that elder meeting younger people whose information may appall you. But your reaction should not be being appalled. It should be gentle correction and welcoming. And I hope you'll remember that. And Mary in the chat room, Mary Cavalcante says, "I'm so glad that I met you on my spiritual journey." Thank you, Mary. I'm glad I met you too. That is our show for today. And tonight I will be doing my chat room on Patreon. If you're not familiar with my Patreon, you can find it at revdonlewis.com. And if you like my work, I hope you'll consider supporting me through Patreon. And with that, we've come to the end of our half hour. I'll be back tomorrow. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about, but I'll know by then. It will not be my other least favorite meme. My other least favorite meme is Aunt Jemima made Nancy Green's memory immortal. I despise that meme because it's utterly untrue. But Nancy Green herself is a fascinating woman who that is doing absolutely nothing to memorialize. But with that, I thank you for your attention. And if you want to find out about Nancy Green, go out and actually research her and find out what really happened. And you'll find out they didn't really do that much for her, but they did give her a place in history as the first performer to be a company spokesperson's spokescharacter. But with that, I want to wish you a happy day. Let us close with our prayer as we always do, and I'll see you tomorrow. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to focus on the positive. And when we encounter things that are not positive, let us try to find positive ways to improve them. Let us welcome younger people that we meet, and let us work to build a positive sense of our own history as we go forward. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for this and everything you do for us in our lives. And knowing you are always with us, still from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always. And again, I'll see you tomorrow.